Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion on astrology, art, and adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore the current planetary alignments and offer insights for coping with change. Educational, informative, enlightening, the Turning of the Wheel is a welcome pause in your daily swirl of constant change. Through intelligent discourse, inspired guests, and educational segments, I will help to enlighten your knowledge of astrology and guide you to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Call in with your questions and speak with some of the greatest visionaries in the time-tested practice of astrology. Turning of the Wheel, Astrology, Art, and Adventure with Chris Flisher, each week on Turning of the Wheel podcast.
Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flisher. As you know, this is a show about astrology. And oftentimes when I talk about astrology, I like the bigger mundane pictures that astrology provides for us, because in that we see the great wisdom of time moving through the centuries and epochs and eras. And it's great to be able to look at that through the eyes of a philosopher. My guest is just that. He'll be coming out in a few seconds. Before we start, though, I want to remind you about my newsletter, which goes out every Sunday afternoon. In there you'll find a couple paragraphs of mundane astrology, and then I'll get into the individual signs from there, as well as links to my website, my videos, my podcasts, and all the other content that I provide that's out there is all accessible through my newsletter. My website is turningofthewheel.com or chrisflisher.com, and I also have turningofthewheel.tv. So I just got back about a week ago from the United Astrology Conference in Chicago. I had the good fortune of meeting my next guest, Ray Grasse, out there. We had spoken many times before in the past about his work, which I'm a great admirer of. We finally never connected. We finally were able to connect in person, which was a great honor, and I was able to go hear his talk on astrology and the great ages, which is phenomenal, because astrology in many ways is far more than just your sun sign astrology. Many of the people enjoy sun sign astrology, and I'm not going to put that down. I think it works as well. But what I love about astrology is the sort of the bigger, broader, sweeping, arcing types of movements and social mores that we see, and the cultural trends that we see that occur as the outer planets in particular make their transits. And so it's great to have Ray Grasse on today as my guest. It's wonderful to speak with you again, Ray. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, and it was a great pleasure meeting you as well at the conference.
Yeah, so what I liked about your approach is that you take this 1,000-foot view or 20,000-foot view of history and apply astrology to it, and use astrology as your sort of your lens to look at the course of human history and the great epochs and the social mores and stuff that we go through. And you had mentioned in your talk that we were at the age of, we were coming upon the end of the age of Pisces, entering into the age of Aquarius. And, there really is no hard line when that happens. It's more of an evolutionary time that we sort of see unfolding. It doesn't just, it's Tuesday, so now we're out of Pisces, we're into Aquarius. It's not like that. It happens more gradually. And when you, what are the sort of the markers that you look for when you see that gradual shift? Is it sort of like a blending of colors, like from one color to the next, like a pastel into another color for a visual representation of that? Or how would you characterize when we sort of reach that point?
Some of the events are clear-cut and more dramatic, such as like the discovery of Uranus is a common one that astrologers talk about. That was a milestone, you might say. And I do think there's a number of milestones. There's no one turning point, as you know. Mm-hmm. And some of those might be astrological and astronomical. Some might be sociocultural, like, for example, the founding of the United States was a major turning point, and even things like 9/11, and then there's transitional symbols I talked about in that lecture as well, how you have some events that kind of represent the clash of civilizations between the old and the new, and an example of that would be the abortion debate, for example, mm-hmm. where the pro-life faction, and I'm not taking sides one way or the other here, I'm saying that the pro-faction forces tend to be more oriented within the Christian mythos, whereas the pro-choice faction tends to be more Aquarian, having more to do with independence. And so there's any number of things you can look to. And in the lecture, for example, I talked a lot about film and how if you know where to look, especially at certain times, let's say under certain powerful planetary energies like the mid-60s, And I talked about the movie The Sound of Music, which on the face of it might seem to have very little to do with something like the shift of the ages. And yet, when you look at the symbolism of this woman who is, an aspiring, although not too aspiring, nun, and novitiate, I think is the term, and then she's trying to break free to have this life of happiness and personal pleasure and marriage and a normal secular sort of life. And or you take the jazz singer, that pivotal point in the evolution of cinema, which is the same symbolism of this guy who leaves behind a religious life to pursue jazz, a life as a jazz singer. And so these things are symbols if you know how to read them. And of course, The Wizard of Oz is maybe my favorite because, just an extraordinary set of symbols. And L. Frank Baum was himself quite mystically inclined in certain respects. He joined the Theosophical Society in 1892. And, which has a lot of, kind of occult, esoteric, astrological undertones to it. And the movie talks about this hero's journey, you might say, that Dorothy embarks on, where she's trying to find the answer to a great question. And she finds this wizard figure who's kind of a god symbol, a very Judeo-Christian, fire and brimstone god in the start of it. And then it turns out that he's an ordinary person like she is, and the answer is within you. It's not in some outside savior or outside Judeo-Christian God symbol. It's within you. I mean, there's other things, as you may remember. But so these are examples of how, if you know how to read the symbols of what's going on, you can start to see this transition, playing out right before your eyes.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and those examples in particular are particularly stunning in their clarity for what they're trying to represent. It seems as if, in many ways, the Wizard of Oz is nothing more than a retelling of the Odyssey. In some ways, it's sort of the same mythical kind of platform journey. And I'm wondering in your opinion, do you think that these stories they're a repetition each time we hear them? They're a repetition of the similar theme that has happened before. It's just in a different place and time with different players, different things. So that, when we are contemporary people living in contemporary times, our stories are going to be contemporary, but they are still emblematic and representative symbolic of that same story over and over again.
But, here's the thing. Yes, that's very true. And there's Joseph Campbell used to talk about this a lot when he would quote Adolf Bastian and the notion of local ideas and elementary ideas, I think was the terms, how some ideas seem to recur throughout different cultures.
Right,
But sometimes the themes themselves seem to change. So, for example, the other thing that I talked about in that lecture about the Wizard of Oz was look at the old mythologies about, let's say, Jason and the Argonauts or the Knights of the Round Table going out for the Holy Grail. They're all looking, in those ancient myths, they tend to be going out in looking for the same thing. The Argonauts were looking for the Golden Fleece. The Knights of the Round Table were looking for the Holy Grail. But the thing that's different about the Wizard of Oz is you have these four uniquely different beings setting out on a quest. Each one is looking for something fundamentally different. And that is a profound shift from the old mythologies. And I talked in the lecture as well about, I feel, if you want to understand the distinction between the Piscean Age mythos and the Aquarian Age mythos, look at the difference between a Gregorian choir and a jazz band.
Right.
In a Gregorian choir, you're all more or less pooling your efforts towards a transcendental goal, and individual self-expression and creativity is discouraged. You're basically subsuming your individual personality for the sake of the greater whole, whereas in a jazz band, each person's individual creativity is encouraged. And likewise, when you look at the Wizard of Oz, it's based on that jazz model. I don't mean L. Frank Baum.
Right.
But the idea that they're a group, that's the interesting thing about Aquarius. It's both Uranus and Saturn. There's a structure there, but there is freedom within the structure. There is a certain kind of ability to improvise, to kind of go your own way. So these four creatures, these four beings are going to meet the wizard, but they each have a fundamentally different goal. So yes, the myths recur in different clothing throughout the eras, but sometimes the themes change in very interesting ways.
Yeah, and do you think that indicates a progress with regard to evolution, since we are moving from sort of a collective to a personal sort of branding? Like if the Gregorian choir is a group working together, and the jazz musicians tend to be, they work together, of course, they work in concert with each other, but they do have a distinctive individuality to them. Do you think that's a trend that we can see? I mean, in some ways you could argue that's kind of what Facebook is. I mean, Facebook is nothing more than everybody touting their own billboard, their own horn, right?
Yeah, and Facebook is interesting because, in the old days, before we had the interactive dimensions of, let's say, the computer network, people would sit around, let's say everybody watching the Super Bowl 30 years ago would be sitting passively watching the exact same thing. The thing that's different now, let's say with Facebook or some of these online interactive group games, is that there is that interactive component, that it makes it much more like the jazz sort of thing.
Right,
now,
yeah.
That by itself isn't inherently good or bad, but, because any of these things can be taken, to an extreme. But yeah, I think that that interactive thing is an important distinction as well that makes it different from the Piscean Age mythos.
Right. I mean, now more than ever, people who are on Facebook as, astrologer, whoever the people may be on there, whatever their trade may be, they sort of own their own brand, so to speak, and everybody becomes their own individual brand in a way that has never been witnessed before. So whereas before we used to be more, and which is kind of odd because if I think of Aquarius and the time that it represents as more of a collective sort of tribal community organization, community-based type of theme, whereas Facebook, even though it has the Uranus, sort of, an inventiveness about it and the innovation quality, it doesn't have that. And it does, even though it does bring us all together on that one platform, the purpose of being on that platform is not to sort of gather within a tribe so much as it is to sort of stand out within the tribe as your own individual. At least yeah.
But the extreme of that is any of these things have their constructive and destructive potentials. And so one of the things with Facebook, as just one example of interactive media, is that it can become very narcissistic and insulating. So where you start getting into your own insular tribal groups, instead of being, I'm not quite sure how to say this, it's like there can be a certain isolation with interactive media like Facebook, and a certain narcissism, or like a navel-gazing, where each person becomes their own little island. Mm-hmm. So there is interactivity, but that can also be taken to an extreme. And yeah, I've read articles where they talk about how one of the dangers of, let's say, social media is people do start developing enclaves. So you've got your heavy liberal groups that start to congregate. You've got your heavy conservative groups that start to congregate, and they don't really communicate that well to each other. So it's any of these things, like I said before, can be taken to a dangerous extreme if it's not, checked.
Right, and there really is no way to check it because it has to be self-checking in some ways. I mean, people are, whatever content that's put out there, whatever connections that are made, are driven by the individual rather than the organization. I mean, I suppose Facebook does have some authority over that, but it does really come down to what you put out there is what you are saying for yourself. And we've never had a situation like that before, which really does sort of support your theory of this idea of moving towards this evolutionary age where we sort of change this whole perspective. And that is, I guess it's a natural progression, kind of going off your idea of the jazz group where these individuals all take a chance to stand up and do their solo, but they still work together. So in that regards, Facebook is kind of a mirror of the same type of theme, correct?
Yeah, and I think Facebook, in some sense, if you had to pick a symbol that expressed the emerging great age, you could do a lot worse than pick Facebook. It represents the best and the worst in some ways of the emerging age. The best being that sense of community, that sense of the potential of using it for constructive activism and for creativity, expressing your personal creativity. But the negative side being that, in a way, you can be connected to someone in Japan more closely than knowing who your next door neighbor is.
Right.
No, it's a weird paradox, irony that's taking place with social media.
That is one of the most startling things to me, because it seems to me, from a logical standpoint, that we as a species, getting back to our very primal base, really do need connection, and we're getting it, but we're getting it in a very odd way through the Aquarian, I think is a good word for it, the Uranian Aquarian construct of Facebook, because like you say, if your house is burning, you're not going to get on Facebook and talk to that guy in Japan. You're going to run next door to your neighbor and get him to get his garden hose in your house or whatever. So there, and I think in many ways we sacrifice the face-to-face connection that human beings would have, just as dogs or cats do when they see each other, for this sort of other connection, which is a false reality. Even though, like you say, you could be very close to somebody very far away. I'm sure people have fallen in love over Facebook and gone on to live, lives or whatever. But it just provides that there's a distraction in between.
It's a very cerebral connection, because Aquarius is an air sign, and it's very cerebral in a lot of ways. It's detached. And so I think Facebook, to a certain extent, reflects that in the sense that you have these mass friendship connections and networks with people around the world, and yet it's largely through electrons. Right. It's largely mental, and that I don't mean that as a bad thing. I just mean it reflects, that side of Aquarius. It's not like there's not an emotional bonding in the same way that, let's say, you're touching and feeling somebody, you're hugging them. It's not that kind of warmth. It's more like a cerebral sort of network of friendship.
Yeah, it's intellectual. The conversation is there, and you connect via your sort of your common interests or your intellectual, which is a great way to connect. I always argue that one of the best ways to form a relationship with anybody is to have a good mental conversation with them, and whereas friendship in many ways supersedes romance in some relationships because it's a stronger bond. Ultimately, romance can be fleeting, and friendship tends to be more lasting. But the idea that as we're moving into this age, and this is probably the greatest single harbinger of this new age arrival, I think, is Facebook is probably is where we will historians will look back and say this is where we sort of arrived. I mean, someone like such as yourself 100 years from now may be looking back and saying this is the great age, and this is when the great age began to change towards the introduction of Facebook, because it did change the way we interact.
Yeah. And there's also that side of social media, which is potentially, anyway, the element of social control, insofar as who are the forces behind Facebook, or who are the forces that manipulate Facebook, whether that be foreign governments or the CIA or whatever. We don't fully know all that just yet, but there's certainly evidence that people can be controlled en masse via things like social media, which also reflects, I think, there is a side to Aquarius in the Aquarian age that potential danger of, I think, the tyranny of Uranus, the tyranny of that kind of, could be corporations, could be government, but there's that dance between independence and structure. There's that it's a razor's edge that we have to walk in terms, those extremes.
But do you think that it heralds more of the arrival of, say, the age of the individual? Does that ring true to you in some ways with regard to this? I mean, because of the fact that people are, you sort of do brand yourself in some ways by what you state, what the photos you post. You sort of give yourself, you build a context for your personality, and you want, the goal, of course, as everybody seems to think, is to get all those likes and stuff like that, to sort of support you in that regard. Do you think that's part of that?
Absolutely, but I think that people sometimes ask me, does Aquarius rule the individual or the group? And my answer is it's both.
It really is both, yeah.
Dance between the two. It's the struggle to balance the two. So you see this teeter-tottering through modern history between one or the other. So, for instance, in the lecture, I also talked about the distinction between the French Revolution and the American Revolution. The French Revolution was all about the group, about the collective. It didn't put any emphasis on the individual, paradoxically enough, and as a result, the individuals became disposable. The thing that the founding fathers did, though obviously we haven't quite lived up to this, was they created the Bill of Rights, which gave equal value to the individual, so that we did not simply fall into mob mentality.
Right.
But there's this constant throughout American life over the last 200 some years. There's this constant teeter-tottering between the right of the individual versus the right of the group or the individual or the government, and now corporations, of course. So I do think the individual is absolutely a vital part of this. And yet, how do we keep that individuality, especially also in the face of the invasion of privacy that social media and media in general is creating for us?
That is the ultimate question. I mean, we sort of are in that. I guess we're really treading in unknown territory right now. We're traipsing in unknown territory because we do not really fully understand the ramifications. And I think there's probably, because our eyes have been closed or our eyes have been diverted or distracted, much has probably been going on behind the scenes that we're unaware of. I mean, we just the headlines today about all this information that was sold by Facebook to China. I mean, it's pretty daunting the way that goes. But it does. I mean, I see Aquarius as the same way you do. I see it both as a sort of a staunch individual, but also part of a collective. But it's a more of a it seems to me to be more of a sort of calculated kind of exchange. When I think of Aquarius, I think of there's a certain sense of detachment there and chilliness, almost to the point where the greater picture is far more important than the smaller picture, and I think that holds true for Aquarius. But when we look at Facebook, where it's just the opposite in some ways, where it really is about the personal expression of an individual, stating something on a sort of electronic highway, where you're putting your billboard up and saying, "This is who I am. Here, take me for what I am. Make your opinions be known." Then it becomes a sort of a different. It sort of embraces, I guess, both in some ways, right?
I'm not sure I quite get the question. Could you repeat
that? Yeah,
well,
I mean, I'm sort of rambling. It's kind of a complicated question. I was just sort of putting it together in my head. When we think of, I think of Aquarius as very much of as a theme, as a concept, as a symbol of it's a collective symbol applying to many people as a community. And yet, and that's Facebook is a community of sorts. But yet, one of the major things about Facebook is this sense of individuality, where people get up there and are allowed to sort of state their case. Those really, too, the sort of that greater tribal piece and then the small individual piece really do sort of fit into that greater picture of what Aquarius is all about.
Absolutely. And both Pisces and Aquarius, they're the last two signs of the zodiac, and I take that as meaning that they're both group-oriented, but with that fundamental difference. And as we try to move into this coming age, out of the Piscean age, there's this profound struggle taking place, which I think does have, to some extent, its most dramatic expression in, well, there's a couple, the abortion debate being one of them, but the clash between, let's say, religious fundamentalism, Christian and Islamic and perhaps others out there, versus, let's say, the secular independence of the modern era. This is an ongoing problem. Because in the religious era, the individual is not considered that important. And how do we reconcile that? How are we going to come to terms with, let's say, the religious fundamentalism that, especially since 9/11, it's not just the Islamic fundamentalist; it's the Christian fundamentalist as well that we're dealing with on this.
Right, they're just as much of a piece of the formula as the other half. I mean, they're if anyway, they're both fueling each other with the same sort of angst back and forth. Right. The idea of this individuality raises an interesting point, because if we see a focus on individuality of some sorts within, it does come down to this larger tribal aspect, like you mentioned. Like the fundamentalists are very much sort of bound by their dogma and their belief system, and their belief system is really very much of a sort of, like you say, a divisive kind of angle, wouldn't you say? I mean, they're very much in that regard. How does that manifest when it comes out across the globe? Or how do you see that unfolding, I guess, historically? How would you envision that happening?
You mean in the future, or how it's happening?
Yeah, in the future. Well, I mean, sort of using today's example of what the future might portend.
I really think, again, we can look to America as an exemplar of what ideally could happen. The age of Aquarius isn't freedom from religion, it's freedom of religion. Mm-hmm. And as a result, like America brought about this jazz sensibility when it comes to religion. Each person, there is no state monolithic religion. Either every person can choose their own religion or no religion at all. And they're all supposedly trying to live in harmony with one another, like those four beings walking to, Oz. And so ideally, I think that we're moving towards this freedom of religion ideal where people can live in harmony. Again, though, it comes down to where the fundamentalists stand for that.
Right, and because they are still living in a sort of a limited past, I guess, because they're still of the tribal nature.
And the monolithic tribal nature.
Yeah, a monolithic tribal nature. There's that collective sort of holds them back from moving forward, and it's sort of the whole idea of the blind follower. You can't be, if you're a blind follower, you'll just take whatever medicine is given to you in some regard, and then you just take it and go blithely on your way. And it comes to terms like Jim Jones and people like that as religious leaders who had this great power to sway people.
But now, you have to wonder what will turn this around, if anything can. And one thing certainly would be, well, maybe not, but let's say if we make contact with extraterrestrial intelligences or make contact with us, how is that going to affect the fundamentalists? And that's an age-old question that academics have been and religious historians have been contemplating now for quite a few decades, if not centuries. And I think that could go one of two ways. It could obviously open up a lot of eyes, or it could just cause those fundamentalists to entrench even deeper in saying this is Satan or this is, the devil's work of these beings that are pretending to be, altruistic to help us, if indeed that's what they're going to do. But that, I think, would be a religion or not, I think that could be a fundamental turning point in terms of the shift from Pisces to Aquarius.
Yeah, I think that would depend upon the impact and how that whole event unfolded. I think that if there was irrefutable that this was a presence in our lives and we could not deny it, we would find ourselves. I often thought when I was a child that the only way the world would ever see peace is if we had a common enemy of some sort, or a common goal, not necessarily an enemy, but a common goal. Where we all brought us together, we put down our arms because we had to solve a singular problem that affected each one of us, which might be, as you mentioned, alien intervention. It might also be climate related, whereby, the only thing that's going to bring us together is if we see, our Earth is falling apart, and that is the great unifier that brings us back together at some point in time.
Unless the fundamentalists say this is the kind of precursor to end times, and therefore they might welcome it as presaging the second coming. That's the danger of that one.
This is that the rapture has arrived, right? Exactly. Yeah, I can see that as well. It is an interesting construct, though, and I think that as we move forward down this road, and we see ourselves in this gradual shift, what question I think of is do you think that the rate of progress has accelerated over this as because of our technology, because of our immersion in these connections? I mean, the fact that we can connect with someone from Japan or Australia or whatever and do it instantaneously, does that then speed up the whole process? And then does that speed up the process of evolution or speed up the process of this sort of shift as we see it?
I think it's accelerating at an uncanny pace. I was just thinking the other day about, when did Orville and Wilbur Wright fly from Kitty Hawk and how fast it got to being on the moon, us walking on the moon. And it seems to be speeding up. And I think both the good and the bad is speeding up. The evolutionary potentials in terms of our mental capacities and our on an intellectual level, the fact that we have such extraordinary resources now at our disposal through something as simple as Google, or not so simple. Yeah. On the other hand, obviously, this is speeding up the potentials for greed and for destruction and for sociopaths to run the world and run us. So it's all bets are off.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of what Future Shock was all about. If you ever read that book, that was about the rate of progress and how we are accelerating as time goes. And that makes sense. It sort of it falls in line with momentum, I guess, as which is sort of physics concept, and it certainly does make sense in that regard. We're talking today. My guest today is Ray Grasse. His website is raygrasse.com. That's Grasse. Ray is his first name, Raygrasse. He's the author of Under a Sacred Sky, The Walking Dream, Signs of the Times, and An Infinity of Gods, his most recent book, which is his talks with Shelley Trimmer. He's an astrologer, a philosopher, a photographer, and a musician, and a fascinating man to listen to. I had the good fortune of seeing him talk at UAC out in Chicago recently, and I was so impressed by the talk and so enlightened by the talk that I had to keep talking more with him. So we'll take a quick break right now. We'll be back in about 2.5 minutes. We'll continue our discussion with Ray, so hang in there. In the meantime, check out his website. He's got beautiful stuff out there. He's a wonderful photographer as well as an author and a philosopher and astrologer. So raygrasse.com, and we'll be back in a few minutes.
What is your destiny? Where are you going? What is your real purpose? Do you know? Do you want to know? Of course you do. It's your duty to yourself. We are all here for a reason, and we all have great potential. Discover all of this and more with a professional astrology reading. My name is Chris Flisher, and I can help you. Discover your strengths and work on your weaknesses, and live your life to its fullest capacity. Based on your birthday, birthplace, and birth time, an authentic astrology reading will allow you to live your life to the fullest and reveal your true purpose. Only real astrology can give you real information. It is your destiny, and it is your path. Write me at chris@chrisflisher.com and book a reading today. Or call me at 978-393-1036. That's 978-393-1036. www.chrisflisher.com.
Astrology is the science of spirit, and it can serve as an invaluable aid in making the difficult choices in life and seeking truth in all the directions we choose. It holds the potential to allow each of us to evolve to our highest potential. It is the logic of the universe, the code of existence, and the pathway to true wisdom. It is our duty to draw from it the instructions for our lives and to live them to our fullest potential. As the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed.
Hi, your host, Chris Flisher here. I've been producer and host of this podcast and radio show for the past 10 years. My goal has always been to provide enlightening, progressive, and logical discussions about where we are as a species and how we move ourselves further down the road towards our greater potential. I believe astrology provides a great tool for observing our progress and awakening our consciousness to becoming a whole, better, and more complete individuals. I have sought to invite the best contemporary guests, thought leaders, and progressive minds to discuss topics that concern us all, regardless of your beliefs. Consider making a contribution through PayPal to help keep the great wheel turning so that I can continue for the next 10 years along the same enlightened path. As always, I thank you for your support.
Okay, welcome back to Turning of the Wheel. My guest today is Ray Grasse. He's an author, an astrologer, a philosopher, and a musician, and a great photographer as well, as I mentioned. His website is Raygrasse, RayGrasse.com, and I encourage you to go there and seek out his advice and counsel. He's a very wise man and understands a great deal. And I'm always fascinated listening to you talk, Ray, about these I think of astrology. I love the sun sign astrology. I love regular basic astrology. But when it comes to mundane astrology, when you see these big sweeping things and you can observe these large social changes and stuff, I'm fascinated by that. And we see these and they are marked by the planetary cycles. We see these cycles of 84 years or 28 years or 12 years, and we see major events happen depending upon the planet that's involved and its influence on us. When you look back, you've seen certain sort of windows of historical importance that seem to be more pertinent than others. Growing up in the 60s, I would say that was a very pivotal time that was far different from anything we'd seen before. And we probably are due for something else along those lines now. Or maybe perhaps we're already in the midst of it. We just haven't got the historical perspective. Where do you think those windows are, and where do you think we're headed in that regard?
Well, let me back up just a little bit and say, they do happen quite often, though some are much more powerful than others. So, for instance, you had when you have the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto, forming relationships with one another, alignments. Those tend to be the major triggers, and one of the big ones was in the 1890s when Pluto and Neptune conjuncted, and that was a major turning point in terms of technology, the birth of cinema, You had occult groups like the Theosophical Society and the Golden Dawn and the Parliament of World Religions, and et cetera. And then you had like the 1960s, like you mentioned, which, you and I are the same age, and so we remember very well. It was just this explosive period when everything just seemed to be up for grabs, and you saw both the good and the bad of this revolutionary turmoil. And the kids born in the mid-60s kind of partake in that spirit. It's interesting to see the people born during these major windows. And then we had the 1990s, which was when Uranus conjuncted Neptune for the first time since around 1821. And that was the year, it was exact in 1993, but you have to give a window on either side. And that was the actual year when the Hubble telescope became active, and that was right when the internet really exploded into consciousness, 94 in particular, and the world music came in, and there was an explosion of mystical, spiritual magazines and books. And then we had this big alignment in 2000 when all these planets lined up in Taurus, which I thought paved the way for 9/11, as long as there was an opposition of Pluto and Saturn involved with that too. But right now we're kind of dealing with the backwash from those, and we also had a Uranus square Pluto, which in the last few years, which stirred up a lot of that 60s fervor, and a lot of the kids that were born in the mid-60s kind of came alive to that revolutionary spirit during that period. But all the upheavals we've seen the last 7 years or so with Occupy Wall Street and so on, and revolutions around the world, actually. So we're dealing with another major period of change, and that's getting stronger the next few years. At the conference, a number of astrologers dedicated their talks to the planetary patterns that are happening in 2020 with the Jupiter conjunct Saturn and 0 degrees Aquarius and Pluto Saturn and all this. And then the United States is undergoing a major change right now in the next few years because of Pluto moving through the United States chart. And I think a lot of what we're seeing in the U.S. anyway, especially because the United States horoscope is being affected so strongly, is we're having to kind of face our own shadow. We're having to deal with some very dark stuff, whether it's racism or fascism, fascist tendencies, authoritarian energies, and so on. And, there's no way to know without a perfect crystal ball exactly what's going to happen. But we're in for kind of a pretty turbulent ride in terms of dealing with these issues, dealing with everything from gun rights to, healthcare to our current president, who seems to be stirring the pot pretty strongly in a lot of ways.
Every way he can, it seems like, yeah.
So these are windows,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's and of course now there's this push towards isolationism and nationalism, where we were trying to pull back from the world, which seems to run counter to what I would perceive as progress. And I always am disappointed in the fact that, as you say, growing up in the 60s, I thought we had the idea. I thought we really had the right idea. And it seems on the surface as if the idea was right. The ideas that were espoused by the play Hair and stuff like that, sort of this, this coming of the age of Aquarius, is tribal community reaching out. But one thing that seems to be missing in this equation, even though Facebook in many ways does provide that global platform for the community, for communities to arise, it doesn't give us that same face-to-face, feet on the ground. Now, when the Women's March happened after the election in 2000, or right around the inauguration, rather, in 2017, we saw the mass pouring out of people on the streets in ways we had not seen since the days of Vietnam. This was we had not seen marches of people this large across the globe getting out and walking, getting their feet on the ground and voicing their concerns. So this is where I think the rubber hits the road. This is really where the action happens, is when you see the people there. I'm not sure that same sort of fervor can develop through an artificial means such as Facebook. I think there's too much in between. I'm curious, do you think that's accurate? Or
I think that the best side of Facebook, aside from the creative individuality that it encourages, is it can become a tool for marshaling people together in terms of social activism. Mm-hmm. And I think on that level, I think it's a very powerful, very positive tool. There's all the negative, which we could spend an hour talking about, from the addiction to, addiction to Facebook, to the superficiality and the narcissism, etc. But on the positive level, what we saw with the women's marches, for example, and various other things, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, and etc., I think that Facebook has a lot of potential on that level, as well as some of the other social media platforms.
Yeah.
And another thing, let me just add to that part of what Aquarius is about is people power. The French Revolution, which happened during a very powerful window, that sense of decapitating the king, as awful that is to think about, that was a profound symbol of the opposite sign of Aquarius is Leo, that's monarchy. And so we're moving into an era when the opposite sign to Leo, Aquarius, is in the ascendancy, and that's people power. So that sense of the rise of the masses, which, again, the danger of that is majority rules, herd mentality, mob mentality. But, if we can walk that tightrope between the individual and the group that I think something like the Bill of Rights symbolizes, I think, we can navigate those straits.
Yeah, there has to be a triggering moment or a triggering movement that gets people to be that. And I think that person has arrived. Or that concept, that division has arrived, because it seems as if with in the arc of a pendulum, if using the pendulum as a symbol, we are going from we swing from one extreme to the other. We're swinging in one direction so far that it is forcing people to take to the streets in some ways, forcing people. More people now are running for office than ever considered before. The voter turnouts are going way up because it is served as a triggering moment for us to be awakened and to say something is wrong here. We've got to resolve this. So, even despite how we may feel about the current political process, and I'm not going to really comment on that, most people know how I feel, despite what we may feel about it, we could also look to it as a triggering moment, because if we did not have such a moment, or a person or entity or movement, we would be placated, we would be complacent, and we would not be willing to, we would not see the impetus to move. This does provide us a sort of a triggering moment to get us moving in the right direction, or back in the right direction.
Right. But I think a really important key is something like net neutrality. How do we keep social media free? How do we keep the internet free? Because
right.
Whoever controls the media controls the masses. That's been known for a long time. Mm-hmm. And it's a constant fight. I don't see this as being. One of the points I made in that lecture was. It's simplistic to think that a given great age is going to be one way or another. Like if you went back in time 2,000 years and you spoke to somebody and said you were from 2,000 years in the future, and someone asked you, well, what's the next 2,000 years going to be like? Are you going to talk about the Inquisition or the Renaissance? Are you going to talk about St. Francis of Assisi or, Torquemada? It's all of those things. And likewise, the age of Aquarius is going to be no different. It's probably going to be a patchwork of varying potentials, some positive, some negative, an unfolding mosaic of possibilities. And, we can, I think, affect that to a great extent, but we're way too early to know how this is going to unfold in, let's say, 500 years from now.
Oh, right, of course. Yeah, no, I understand, of course. But it does seem as though that these events that happen, which seem so outrageous to us in our current daily lives when we see the headlines streaming across our phones or wherever, we see that we're so shocked sometimes by them, and we say they become, because they are so outrageous sometimes, the comments that come across and the events that unfold, they're so outrageous, they do sort of seem to force a response to that. And by that force in that response, I see a sense of engagement and progress, even though it may have come about as an unfortunate way. You sort of, you get woken by, sometimes you get awoken by a mistake that you've made, and that you're forced to correct it. And I wonder if we're not in that sort of stage now.
Well, I think that's a good point. And I think that even though I don't for a moment buy this simplistic notion that I've read in quite a few books about the age of Aquarius being, an age of mass enlightenment or some such thing, there's no question that people are waking up, that there is a sense in which people are more conscious than they were like when you and I were kids. Mm-hmm. And so, I look back at some of the TV shows back in the 50s, for example, reruns, and it's kind of astonishing, the ignorance and the sometimes racism or the way women are portrayed. It's you almost can't believe that.
I know, it's true.
that. And there really are changes taking place. Not enough, but there really are, I think, some fundamental changes as people get more information.
It does seem to have a ratcheting effect to it, though, where you go 2 steps forward, 1 back, 2 steps forward, 1 back. It seems to be that's the nature of progress.
I agree.
I mean, because, you and I growing up in the 60s, we saw, my sons were shocked to know that there were such things as black and white water fountains and black and white, restaurants and places where you could sit and couldn't see it. They were shocked by that when I told them about that when they were younger. But yet we're almost getting back to that stage again. So is this just another reminder to get us to make this thing right? And it just seems kind of, and I guess what brought me to that comment about 2 steps forward and backwards is that I read something about Obama the other day. He was talking about, he wondered if he, out loud in his interview, if he had arrived too soon to the scene because the progress that he was pushing forth, perhaps the world wasn't ready for it, although you and I may have thought we were ready for it and the kind of programs that he did. But then all those forms that all that stuff that he'd done is now being, of course, rolled back, turned down, shut down, and canceled, only to be, revived again the next presidency around? Or what? It's just very unusual to see that happen.
Well, it's an open question, obviously, because it's just, all bets are off. We just don't know.
We just don't know. But it does seem to have that characteristic of, you do wonder if we're way ahead of ourselves. But, you'd think that progress would keep this thing moving forward. There'd be a logical way to go. But, again, it comes back to what you said. It does have to do with sort of the religious component that is, in many ways, has been reignited and sort of recharged in this regard with this new administration that we have.
Well, let me just add that, this notion of going forward then backward, does it ever really go fully backward? I think at times maybe it does, but you look at ancient Greece, for example, and how far they got with democracy, such as it was, but women and slaves weren't allowed to vote, and then you had this lapsing into, it wasn't fully the Dark Ages, some people portray it to be, but you had a backwards movement, clearly, in a lot of respects. But then democracy eventually came back where women and, not only were women allowed to vote, but then, slavery, at least on the surface of things, was eradicated. So, I really do think, even though it's 3 steps forward, 2.5 steps back very often, I still think there really is a spiral, that it goes, higher, that there is an evolution that takes place over the long run.
Right. And these themes do seem to recur. That's a lot of what I think we learn from astrology is by looking backwards, obviously, because we can see, and the longer time marches on, of course, the more empirical data we will have. And when we see that coming up, we do see these recurring themes, which I think of time as a corkscrew. So you have this gigantic thing where you're going around and around and around, but you're always going further down the road each time. And I think that's an accurate metaphor for what progress is like in our lives, because we do see these themes recurring, which brings us back to the idea of, the planetary cycles and the major planets and how we see things going forward. When we see, and many of them we don't really have a lot of history for. We don't really, because Pluto's only been discovered. We can't really apply Pluto. Maybe you think you can. I'm not sure how we can apply Pluto beyond 1930. We can look at it as an entity, but it really didn't come into our consciousness until the 1930s, right? Or do you still apply it even looking backwards in history?
I still apply it looking backwards, but it's not as conscious a factor. For example, if you look at the triple conjunction in the 6th century BC, of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, which is the only time in recorded history that happened, you saw a major transformation taking place in culture, which Rick Tarnas has written about quite eloquently in Cosmos and Psyche towards the end of his book. So even though we didn't even know about those 3 planets consciously, the astrology still took effect.
It still works, yeah.
When Pluto was discovered in 1930, and you had the criminal underworld, and you had movies like Dracula, Frankenstein, and King Kong, and Hitler rose up, and the atom was beginning to be understood, definitely there's something that happens when these planets are discovered that brings it more to the surface, but they're still there even when we're not consciously aware of that planet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Well, that makes me wonder. I'm sort of curious as to what your thoughts are about the coming years, especially within the next couple of years when we do have this Saturn-Jupiter, Pluto conjunction. What does that look like to you, just from some sort of a symbolic level?
Well, I really think that since there's so much emphasis on Capricorn with these planetary patterns, I think there's really a major shakeup taking place in governmental systems, and it may even have to do with what Robert Mueller is going to be doing in terms of court cases and upheavals and battles. I think the next 3 or 4 years in the U.S., well, actually the next 5 years or so, and some would say throughout the 2020s, there's a whole lot of shaking going on. It's really, I'm not going to predict how it's going to unfold, but I really think the Mueller thing is going to be part of it. Mm-hmm. I think that, but it's not just in the U.S. I think that the Saturn-Pluto and the Jupiter-Saturn, it's a major shift taking place, and it may have to do as well environmentally. It already, now that Uranus has gone into Taurus and we see these volcanoes erupting and things like that, I think that the environmental crisis could come to a bit of a head, in the next few years in terms of forcing our hand.
Exactly, forcing our hand. That's one of the things I always thought about too. Is that if there was an environmental problem, supposing just theoretically California did fall into the coast into the Pacific Ocean, as they've always talked about years ago, or something that dramatic happened that could significantly alter our economy in some way, or the world's stability, that would again, I think, force a sort of a unity of in an odd sense, because people would have to come together in order to solve that problem, and it would supersede any of the small border disputes or policy disputes that happen, because this would draw our attention so clearly. But we've already seen the impact of this ever since Pluto entered into Capricorn in 2008. We've seen this gradual sort of chipping away at the foundation of what we thought was normal, what we thought were bedrock ideals. Just the fact that they're talking about taking Social Security away and and Medicare and stuff like that. These are basic things, but I think you're right in that what will be discovered, what has yet to have been revealed through the Mueller case, I think will stand the test of time. Much of what has happened is liberties have been taken in this administration because there was never something that said you couldn't do that. It was always implied that you couldn't do it, and decorum and diplomacy ruled that people did not act a certain way and they did not do certain things. But because it was never stated in the Constitution, written down, others thought that gave them license to do whatever they wanted, and they just kept on doing whatever they wanted and walked away with it all. I think a lot of that will be reframed, reconstructed, and spelled out in ways that say, this is how we operate. This is how we conduct business. This is how when you have a trade treaty, you stick to the trade treaty, but you don't just back out of it. It's not like taking the ball and going home when you're playing kickball as a kid. It's not the same as that. And I'm wondering, when you see this deterioration of these structures, like you say, governments and of course the Earth, that would be indicative of a major change. And the Saturn. I think Saturn brings to it a sense of sobriety and reality. I mean, Pluto obviously is the one that's in charge of that, but Saturn sort of brings to it a sense of do the right thing, humans, and you'll be okay if you get this done right. It's sort of forcing us to do the right thing, don't you think, in some ways?
Yeah, but there's another factor here which I forgot to add, which is, there's an old saying that all wars are bankers' wars. The banks really run the world, mm-hmm. And part of what I think may be happening with the Pluto-Saturn in Capricorn is that we're on shaky ground with the economy, not just in the U.S. but on a world level for various reasons. Now, how is that going to play out the next few years? We could have another 2008 quite easily if we don't play our cards right, and that would in turn affect the governmental structure. That might affect the environmental as well because of certain cuts that would be made and so on. A lot may hinge on how we deal with the economy the next few years, and that may be what these astrological energies are pointing to more than anything else, possibly.
Yeah, I can see that. I think that makes the most sense of anything I've heard, because I think that the picture looks rosy now because the unemployment's low, the stock market's flying. I think those are all false fronts in some ways, because the ripple effect of what's being put in place now may bring that all that crashing down, and we don't know that yet. But I think you're right. I think the money is really going to be, and I think there's enough loans out there, student loans, whatever it may be, credits, housing, mortgages, whatever. that could easily tip one way or the other, especially if things get really dicey there. And then, the whole restructuring of how that, how does money get reinvented? You talked about the idea of Bitcoin and how the electronic, the disappearance or the slowly disappearing value of cash. I mean, cash, I think, is still going to be viable in some ways, but do you see that disappearing or changing?
I've been asked that before, and I'm not sure what to say. I think that would be resisted very strongly by the population. I know some countries are experimenting with that, but I just can't see cash disappearing. But I do think this notion of decentralized electronic, money, Bitcoin and all that, I think that's definitely, kind of the wave of the future to some extent. But that's not an area I know a whole lot about, but I think it certainly fits into the Aquarian paradigm to some extent.
Yeah, it does, especially given the idea of where we're going. But and so many things happening electronically, whereby money gets deposited electronically and it goes out electronically. You hardly even see it. You don't really see it. You just click yes or no on a bank card or whatever, and it's gone. And that may be. I mean, it's great. It's got convenience to it. There's no question about it. But it does also put people out of work. With the so the idea of automation and robots and stuff like that enters into this conversation because we see ourselves going that way. What do you think would be like if we found ourselves in an automated world where we didn't have a purpose for many people who did not get out of bed every day? Now, there's a mayor out in California, in Stockton, California, who is actually paying people not to work. It's not that he's paying them not to work. It's just that they have no money, so he's paying them, and they live off a subsidy provided by the city's taxes. And I'm wondering if you see this as a sort of a trend. What would we do if we were all automated and we have all these people? Where do we go? What do we do?
Yeah, this notion of the guaranteed minimum income or whatever they call that, I don't see how that can be avoided because it's not only a question of automation, it's about outsourcing of jobs.
Right.
And, you're going to have an awful lot of people out of work, and that's going to be a very unhappy populace if you don't find some solution for that. I think that may have to be the way it goes. It's,
I'm not even sure they know how to wrestle with that because that might be sort of the thing that precipitates some sort of a revolution, I think, in some ways, because if people don't have a purpose, don't have a goal, don't have a reason, a raison d'etre, a reason to live, they are going to become incredibly restless, or they'll turn their energy someplace else. The old phrase, an idle hand is the devil's workshop, playground, or whatever the word is. You can see that coming, and yet when we have jobs being taken away, cars will soon, trucks will soon be driven by satellite or whatever GPS systems. Where do these people go, and how does that sort of play out in the greater span and evolution of humanity over time? I just don't see how that works.
Well, one of the things that I feel is important, towards the end here to say is that I'm very optimistic in the sense of there's never a utopia on Earth. I mean, I think it's foolish to think there's ever going to be a perfect society. But there's always the possibility for, getting your own life together, and I think people are adaptable. And I think that even if, let's say, things get difficult with the economy, I think that there are ways around that in terms of people may move in with each other. There may be ways of, I'm just not pessimistic. And I've lived long enough to hear people talk about, the end of the world enough times to realize that, usually that's not what happens. And I think that even though things could get bleak in some respect with automation and with the politics, I think it's, entirely possible that we can still work through this, and especially with social media, the positive potential, using that as a way to effect change. You see how people can mass together and effect change in terms of boycotting businesses or electing their own officials. I'm ultimately hopeful.
Yeah, I have to say I take the same stance. I have always been an optimist at heart, and I do see the greater good in all this. It's just it's interesting to sort of take the long view of it and see where we're going. I can't think of a better way to end the show than what you said, Ray, so I'm going to end it there. My guest today has been Ray Grasse, wonderful astrologer out of Chicago. His website is Ray Grasse, RayGrasse.com. He wrote Under a Sacred Sky, The Waking Dream, Signs of the Times, and An Infinity of the Gods are his books. I encourage you to look into them. They're great, interesting. I like these large views of the world and evolution because I think they inspire me in some way. It's something about I just love the way it works. He's an astrologer, photographer, philosopher, and musician. And it was great to see you out in Chicago, Ray. I really appreciate what you're doing in your work, and I think your attitude and your approach to this sort of history is really very compelling. So I appreciate very much you coming on today.
Thanks so much.
And once again, Ray Grasse, RayGrasse.com. Ray Grasse is his site. And thanks again, Ray, and we'll hopefully see you soon. Take care.
You've been listening to Turning of the Wheel with your host, Chris Flisher. To schedule a reading with me or to order artwork, you may visit my website at www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. Or you can call me at 978-393-1036. Thank you. And as always, be open to possibilities.